Don Perkins played 8 seasons with the Dallas Cowboys, and in that time, he rushed for over 6,200 yards, added another 1,300 yards through the air, and made it to the end zone 45 times. Also drafted by the AFL's New York Titans, Perkins signed with the Dallas Cowboys for a $10,000 salary and a $1,500 signing bonus. In 1961, Don Perkins was the NFL Rookie of the Year, rushing for over 800 yards. He scored 5 touchdowns, had another 300 yards receiving. He is still, to this day, the Dallas Cowboys' 4th leading rusher, trailing only Tony Dorsett, Emmitt Smith, and Ezekiel Elliott. Blessed with outstanding speed and balance, Perkins was also an excellent pass blocker, and he retired before the 1969 season as the 5th leading rusher in NFL history. Hall of Famer Leroy Kelly was drafted in 1964, and in that year's training camp was nearly cut by the Cleveland Browns before his teammate Jim Brown had to intervene and convince the coaches to keep him on for one more week so that he could recover from some injuries that he was suffering from. Jim Brown retired in 1965, and that's when Leroy Kelly took over. In just a hair over 4 seasons before the decade ended, Leroy Kelly rushed for 4,500 yards, twice rushed for over 1,200 yards in a season, scored an unbelievable 59 touchdowns, had another 103 receptions for another 1,300 yards, led the league in rushing twice, and led the league in touchdowns scored 3 times. Despite playing behind Jim Brown for 2 full seasons, Leroy Kelly retired from the NFL in 1973 as the 4th leading rusher in NFL history. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, if you could please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. And the 3rd greatest running back of the 1960s, Chicago Bears legend, Gale Sayers. In Sayers' rookie season of 1965, he scored an amazing 22 touchdowns, including 6 in one game. And he led the league in all-purpose yards that season and won the Rookie of the Year award. His 1966 season was even better as he rushed for over 1,200 yards and set the NFL record for all-purpose yards. In the 60s, he led the league in yards per game 3 times, total rushing yards twice, and all-purpose yards 3 times. As dangerous as Sayers was taking handoffs in the backfield, he was maybe even more dangerous as a return specialist. In just a 3-year span, he scored 8 return touchdowns and led the league in kickoff return average twice. For nearly 50 years, Gale Sayers was the only man to score a rushing touchdown, a receiving touchdown, and a return touchdown in the same game. That was until 2016 when Tyreek Hill did the same thing. Gale Sayers is the youngest player ever inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and he is one of only 5 players in the Super Bowl era to be inducted into the Hall of Fame without ever having played a postseason game. And the 2nd greatest running back from the 1960s, another franchise legend, this time with the Green Bay Packers, Hall of Famer Jim Taylor. Jim Taylor rushed for over 1,000 yards 5 times in the 1960s. In 1961, he rushed for over 1,300 yards. And then in 1962, the year he won the National Football League MVP, he rushed for nearly 1,500 yards. You have to remember, in the 60s, they're playing a 14-game schedule. So he led the league in rushing touchdowns twice, while totaling 76 for the decade, and had another 7 touchdowns receiving. In the 7 years in the 1960s that he played for the Green Bay Packers, he amassed over 7,500 yards rushing and another 1,300 yards through the air. Jim Taylor's very last game with the Green Bay Packers was in the very first AFL-NFL championship game, which we now know better as Super Bowl I. If anybody in the comments could tell me how Jim Taylor ended up playing his last season in New Orleans, only rushing for 390 yards, and yet the Saints still retired his jersey number. As great as all of those 4 running backs were, none of them held a candle to Mr. Jim Brown. He was truly a man amongst boys. Jim Brown is the only running back in the 1960s to average over 100 yards per game, and nobody else was even close. Nobody else even averaged 80 yards per game. In the 6 years in the 1960s that Jim Brown played, he led the league in rushing 5 times, he led the league in average yards per game 5 times, and he rushed for over 1,400 yards 4 times, including 1963 when he rushed for over 1,800 yards. Now you got to remember, in the 1960s, they're only playing 14 games per season. On top of all of those great rushing numbers, he caught over 200 passes and had over 2,000 yards receiving in the 1960s alone, and 84 touchdowns. In 1965, at the age of 30, he once again led the league in rushing yards per game, and touchdowns, and was named NFL MVP. And then he promptly retired to pursue a career in acting. It was important to him to retire while he was on top, and he did. And it was also important to him to retire before his aggressive running style took its toll on his body. And there you have it, everybody. My take on the top 5 running backs from the 1960s. I would love to hear your opinions, how you would do things differently. I love the conversation. Everybody, have a good night. Thanks for watching.